Welcome. Thank you for joining us for Afghanistan After the Collapse. Where are we now and what comes next? My name is Matt Kokonos. I'm the coordinator of the Negotiation Task Force, which is a scholar entrepreneur initiative at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, promoting innovative solutions to Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian security challenges by creating spaces for cross-cultural negotiation research, training, and strategic analysis. We pioneer new models for high-impact knowledge dissemination, train practitioners in advanced negotiation skills, and build long-term conflict management capacity. It is now my pleasure to introduce Fara Abbas, who is a fellow with the Davis Center's Negotiation Task Force and a specialist on Afghan affairs. She served in senior government positions, representing Afghanistan in international negotiations and conferences. Most recently, she served as Director of Programs at the Office of National Security Council, and prior to that as Deputy Director General for International Relations, where she advanced the government's foreign and security policies. She's a graduate of Stanford University with an MA in International Policy Studies, with a focus on international security and cooperation. Fara, please take it away.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the panel discussion on Afghanistan after the collapse. Where are we now and what comes next? Today marks the 6th-month anniversary of the collapse of Afghanistan's former government and Taliban's rapid takeover. While this swift change of power has largely ended violent conflict, it has plunged the country into an economic turmoil and one of the gravest humanitarian crises. By mid-2022, the UN Development Program estimates that 97% of Afghanistan's population will plunge into poverty. More than 23 million Afghans already face acute hunger. To counter these grim forecasts, the United Nations has asked donors for $8 billion in aid for this year alone, at a time when the Taliban regime remains under economic sanctions and lacks diplomatic recognition. At the heart of the issue is the makeup of the Taliban's interim government. Having kept members of the old guard in the top echelon of the leadership means that the prime minister, the two deputy prime ministers, and almost all cabinet ministers and their deputies are under international sanctions or are wanted. Both the Taliban and its major faction, the Haqqani network, are labeled specially designated global terrorists by the US government, prohibiting transfer of funds into the country ruled by the group. The lives of millions of Afghans will depend on how the Taliban choose to govern. At present, the government is exclusive, insular, ethnocentric, and all-male, although it had initially promised an inclusive government that is tolerant toward women and ethnic minorities. Since coming to power, the Taliban has restricted the rights of girls and women, barring their access to education, work, and public life. The group has tortured or killed journalists, human rights activists, former civilian and military officials, despite promises of amnesty to the latter group. The latest report of the United Nations Security Council Sanctions Monitoring Team suggests that Afghanistan is once again becoming a haven for international terrorism. To prevent renewed conflict, the region and the international community has urged the Taliban leadership to form an inclusive and representative government that respects human rights. Doing so will also make it easier for donor governments to help the Afghan people with aid and assistance. Joining us today is a brilliant panel of experts. Dr. Rasul Taleb is the former senior advisor to the president and former member of the negotiating team of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Dr. Taleb is a former Mujahideen who fought against the Soviets, serving as the Central Council member of the Wahdat political party. Dr. Taleb has attended UN meetings to form an interim government to replace Dr. Najibullah's government in the 90s, meetings of the Mujahideen leaders that led to the Islamabad and Mecca agreements, and negotiations with the Taliban leadership in 1998. Dr. Taleb holds a medical degree from Kabul University. Also joining us is Lynn O'Donnell, who is a journalist and author. Between 2009 and 2017, she was Afghanistan Bureau Chief for AFP and the Associated Press. She has an MA in War Studies from King's College London. She is presently a columnist for foreign policy and writes for prestigious publications worldwide. Also joining us is Andrew Watkins, who is a senior expert with the U.S. Institute of Peace. He was previously the International Crisis Group's senior analyst for Afghanistan and has worked across the country for the United Nations, humanitarian organizations, and the US government. He has written extensively about the Taliban and conflict dynamics in Afghanistan and on wider regional politics and diplomacy. Lastly, Syed Madadi is also joining us, who until recently was the Director of Foreign Relations at Afghanistan's State Ministry for Peace, where he was also a senior member of the Joint Technical Secretariat of Afghanistan Peace Negotiations in Doha, Qatar. He has written for academic journals as well as major publications. Syed holds an MA in International Policy from Stanford University and an MA in International Relations from New York University. We will start today's discussion by evaluating the Taliban's performance over the past 6 months. To gain a better insight, we will speak about the new government, their structure, the factions, and their implications on governance. Where does the region stand in all of this? As we witness the unfolding of events, we will discuss expectations for the immediate and near future for the country, its people, and the wider region. The format of the panel of the event will be panel discussion for the first hour, where I will ask questions to our speakers, and that session will be followed by 15 minutes of audience Q&As. I would like to ask the audience to please submit their questions in the chat box, and we will pose them to the speakers at the end of this session. Once again, thank you all for joining us. I would like to start with you, Syed. Can you please share your perspective of what is happening in the country? How do you evaluate the Taliban's performance over the past 6 months?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Fara. And it's very good to be here along such a distinguished other members of the panel. Where can I start on the past 6 months? I think there are obvious aspects of the situation that have unfolded for the past 6 months, which is a growingly humanitarian and economic crisis, and a growingly repressive Taliban regime. So overall, I would say that from where I'm seeing things, the Taliban have not projected a very huge difference from the way that they govern the country when they were last in power in the late 1990s. I would say they have become much, much smarter, but not necessarily better. They have shown a failure to control their forces. Basically, they have failed to project a unity of command and control. There are growing clashes between members of the senior leadership in the movement. There are different units loyal to different members of the leadership, and they do not necessarily are accountable to the entire group. And they've also, I think, have failed to project control over their foot soldiers and fighters across the country, and that's why there's a confusion, I think, about how much of what's happening in terms of Taliban behavior in the country, how much of that is deliberate policy choices and decisions by the leadership, and how much of that is actually happening without necessarily being sanctioned by the senior leadership. For example, there are members of other ethnic groups in the Taliban's cabinet, but at the same time, we constantly hear reports from the ground about continuous persecution of other ethnic groups, Hazaras and Shias, particularly across the country. And often the Taliban leadership has failed to talk or to renounce, for example, these activities very clearly, I would say. There is better security, obviously, and part of the main reason for that is because the main security threat to the country was Taliban for so many years, and now they are controlling the state apparatus. So that doesn't come as a surprise. According to international observers, including the World Bank, they have shown better, or at least more than people expected, capacity in terms of revenue generations. But I think that's because of two reasons. One is that we are seeing a decline in corruption compared to the previous government. And the other, that the public sector, which was the largest employer, has been downsized very drastically, including the security forces. So I think I just mentioned two important points on this one, and then we'll wrap up. One is that we do not know how long will the Taliban stance on corruption will actually hold, because now they have access to resources, they have access to government bureaucracy. So we need to be careful about that, because there are already reports coming from the ground about people being able to buy passports, for example, people being able to buy their way out of the country on the border checkpoints. On the smaller public sector, we need to be careful in terms of the implications of that on already a growing poverty level and living conditions. So my overall assessment is that for the past 6 months, pessimism has grown more and more rather than confidence in terms of how the Taliban would be able to govern.
Thank you so much, Saeed. You have raised some very important points. And on the Taliban structure, factions, and accountability, I want to return to that later. But Lynn, building up on what Saeed said, how do you think the new government is doing? I mean, you're a little, you have followed Afghanistan for a number of years, and there have been lots of predictions on how the Taliban would rule. How much of those predictions actually came true?
Well, you might remember that in the months ahead of the collapse of and as having changed, not being the same as they were the first time around, 96 to 2001. It was Taliban 2.0. They were called reasonable by very senior people. I think it was the head of the British Armed Forces who called them reasonable. We can do business with them now. So while I respect the portrayal of them as having come in and been the same as they were before, I have a feeling that they were somewhat worse, because they came in with a vengeance and with intent on revenge, and started hunting down people. And whether they came in and didn't know what they were going to expect because they didn't expect to take over the way they did on the 15th of August last year, or whether they came in to Kabul bent on revenge, I can't tell you. But there was certainly an immediate attempt to round up people, women went out on the street and made sure that their voices were heard, and they were rounded up and they were detained. And in the months since, we've had an awful lot of disappearances, detentions, arbitrary punishments, if you like. So I don't see them as being the same as they were. I see them as being much worse. And I think this element of revenge is what makes it much more frightening for ordinary people. Also, the brain drain, the huge numbers of people who have been able to leave and to remain in hiding and waiting to leave also reduces the strength of people who might be able to stand up to them. So, if you had a civil society that was strong in numbers as well as voice, then you might see more of a pushback and a little bit more of a determination to stand up. But the fewer people there are, the less ability there is to stand up to what is really quite a brutal attempt, I think, at silencing disparate and dissonant voices. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Lynn. I believe you have raised some poignant points about the new leadership. Yes, there has been persecution and limiting of the civil society, and that prevents any sort of pushback of these repressive policies and the regime itself. And that's a very sad phenomena that we're all witnessing. And unfortunately, the senior UK defense official just recently came out and said that, well, we can still do business with the Taliban. So we're hearing that. I want to bring Andrew to our discussion. Andrew, you have done considerable research on the Taliban. What can you tell us about this group, especially about their structure and some of the factions that are in it? How is the power divided among them? So little is known about the internal politics of this group. How are they negotiating unity and maintaining cohesion?
Yeah, thank you, Fara, and thank you for the invitation from the Davis Center to be here with such esteemed fellow panelists. This question of Taliban unity and of their structure and how they maintain cohesion is something that the Taliban themselves and their leadership have obsessed over. And I would argue is one of the defining characteristics of this group. Those who have followed the events of the conflict in Afghanistan closely will remember that in 2014 and 2015, this group was starting to tear apart, and it was really coming close to fragmenting. And this insurgency that was so successful last year and is now the de facto government in the country really came close to splitting. This was because of a number of reasons. One, the death of Mullah Omar, their founder, which had been covered up and was lied about for years, even among different factions of the leadership. Two, they were being pulled in lots of different directions by their sanctuary and sometime patron, Pakistan. They were being pressured into peace talks with the Afghan government. But really what was going on is, I think, a largely untold story, which is the Taliban were experiencing growing pains. They had scattered during the US invasion and intervention in the country and were militarily defeated. But over the course of a decade, from 2001 until about 2011, they were rebuilding themselves and they were reforming and they were growing much stronger. By the time most US and international forces had left Afghanistan in the end of 2014, the Taliban were spreading all across the country again, but they had to go through this entire evolution of learning how to balance power between their different forces. This is a movement that originated in very particular parts of southern Afghanistan, among very key Pashtun tribal constituencies. But by the time it was spreading across the country last summer, it had diversified its different camps, its different interests, its factions. Some of these were based on a narco-trafficking or smuggling economy. Some of these were based on coercion or deals cut with people who were dissatisfied by the Islamic Republic, the former government. Really, what happened was the Taliban opened up its doors and its entire movement to anybody who was unsatisfied with the status quo, with the former government, with the presence of international troops and really international influence. But what that meant was the more they grew their movement, the more internal factions and disagreements that they had to manage. So what we've seen since August is almost every decision that the Taliban have made, their leadership, the way that they formed a government, even to this day, a constant shuffling of officials, appointing a governor or a deputy minister, and then only weeks later moving them around, is trying to maintain a steady equilibrium, which was very easy for them to do when they were working in the shadows as an insurgency. But now that these are official appointments and are part of the government, It's something that the world can see. So to wrap up, this is a movement that has obsessed over its own cohesion. It spends a great deal amount of time trying to make sure that it remains a unified movement. But unfortunately, any time that a decision comes down to maintaining its own unity or taking care of the Afghan people, the Taliban are clearly tilting in favor of their own movement. And we're already seeing a lot of the results.
Thank you, Andrew. That was very insightful. I want to bring in Dr. Talib, who has worked on the negotiating team and has known Taliban firsthand for a long period now. Dr. Talib, what can you add to what Andrew just shared? As we all know, power corrupts, and absolute power, which the Taliban hold, corrupts absolutely. How are they going to be able to continue maintaining their cohesion now that they don't have any competition from anywhere? So how will they govern and rule while trying to hold on to power?
Thank you. First, let me thank Mr. Ra for inviting me to the event. And special thanks to the Davis Negotiation Task Force at Davis Center for providing this opportunity to discuss the current situation in Afghanistan. Regarding the first question, or Afghanistan after the collapse, I want to mention two aspects of this after the collapse situation. The first is the pain and suffering of the people of Afghanistan, which increased manifold after the collapse. The Afghan people are now facing a humanitarian catastrophe, economic meltdown, massive unemployment, almost halt of the public services by the government. This results to a widespread poverty in Afghanistan. The most painful example of this catastrophe is, as you all probably know, a report that some Afghans were selling their kids to provide foods for their family. What I want to emphasize is this current humanitarian crisis was absolutely avoidable if the Taliban had chosen a peaceful solution for Afghanistan. However, they intentionally thwarted the peace negotiation in Doha and chose a military takeover of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, Taliban are now using the pain and suffering of Afghanistan people to bargain for political recognition for their totalitarian regime in Afghanistan. Regarding the Taliban's structure and their cohesion, I can mention a few things. The reason for such a strong cohesion between different groups, different interest groups, different localities, and many influential groups inside the Taliban, I think we have probably 3 or 4 factors involved on this. The first thing is ideology. Their ideology and their narrative of Islam and Sharia is one of the most important factors that keep Taliban different groups, in rival groups, and even hostile groups together for some ideological narrative, Islamic narrative for the future of Afghanistan. The second factor is ethnic aspiration. As everybody knows, Taliban is one ethnic group, almost all Pashtun, just a few people in the leadership of Taliban is from other ethnic groups. Unfortunately, there's untold narrative inside the extreme ethnic Pashtuns that they own Afghanistan and they have to rule Afghanistan. This is the other factor that keep Taliban different groups together. The third factor is foreign influence. The foreign influence is also one of the most important factors. It has been not paid due attention during international community presence in Afghanistan, that the foreign factor, the Pakistan factor, is the other important thing that keep the Taliban different groups together, and the ideological and ethnic factors give Taliban a motivation for the future to go forward for their ideological goals and the future of Afghanistan. But the foreign factors, I think, manage how to move forward, how to set a goals, how to keep Taliban cohesive and as well as effective militarily for the takeover of Afghanistan. So I think what I can say at this moment, after the collapse, one other factors, it is widely discussed, is a question, is Taliban changed or changing or not? As here we have different views, but keeping in view the past record of Taliban, their fanatic, rigid ideological view of Islam, and other factors, they are not changing. They are not capable of changing. If they change, as it has been said about their cohesion, they will lose that cohesion and fragment to different, maybe hostile groups in the future. So to expect some changes from Taliban is, I think, is a kind of maybe kind of aspiration rather than being a fact. I give you one example for this, that Taliban is not changing and not capable of changing. You know, the core, right at this moment, the core demand of the international community in the US is from Taliban to form inclusive government in Afghanistan. On the one hand, if you think a little bit deeply on this issue, it is a contradictive.
Yeah.
At first, because
I'm sorry. Can I ask you to wrap up your point?
Okay, just a few seconds. Inclusiveness is a contradiction with a totalitarian regime. If you emphasize for inclusive government, at the end, it will consolidate the totalitarian regime rather than forming an inclusive government.
Right.
My point was they are not changing. They claim that they're already inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
That
Exactly.
everybody knows that is not true. That's what I want to finish right now.
Thank you so much. And that nicely brings us to the next question that I want to ask Syed. Syed, how long do you think this interim government that they announced last year will last? Are there any domestic pressure, do you believe, that can force the Taliban to change their policy? And also, the group lacks international diplomatic legitimacy. It is not recognized by any single nation, including its Pakistani patrons. How much of a problem is their lack of legitimacy and diplomatic recognition, do you think?
Thank you, Farah. I think on the sort of the longevity of their interim government, it's hard to predict because there's no specific indicator based on which we can have an expectation of whether they will actually get rid of their interim administration anytime soon. The idea of putting out an interim administration was a political tactical move to manage the optics of their takeover. It was not necessarily out of any sort of administrative concern for effectiveness or the way they would govern. So I don't see any specific reason to have a clear expectation of that interim government change. Last time they ruled, for example, they had an interim administration for the entirety of their rule over Afghanistan, which was nearly 5 years. So it's hard to say, but I think maybe if they can come to some sort of an understanding with other political forces, as they are trying right now through various channels, and then bring some other figures into their government, they would try to do that and then brand that as a more permanent structure. But it's really hard to say. On the issue of legitimacy, there are two aspects of that. Domestically, the Taliban have very long said that they, in an Islamic emirate, in the way that they define it, they think and believe that the legitimacy comes from God. So it's a divine phenomenon rather than from the people. In short, they would prefer to be feared by people than to be loved by people. And as Dr. Taleb earlier mentioned, it's an authoritarian way of government. So it really doesn't matter for them. I don't think they would place a lot of emphasis on domestic acceptance. They care, but they're not going to prioritize it. Internationally, it's more tricky because they have a strong interest in being able to conduct business with the rest of the world, to gain access to financial and political and diplomatic resources, and to be able to travel easily, although they already are, but they would prefer the sanctions to be lifted, the UN sanctions and the American sanctions and others. But as an insurgent group, as an Islamic extremist group, they derive part of their legitimacy, as I argued in an article yesterday, that they derive part of their legitimacy from defying the international order. They brand themselves as anti-American, anti-imperialism, and they're sort of cautious of how their sort of closeness to the international system that's controlled by the United States and its allies would appear in the eyes of its constituency. When they were negotiating with the United States, they tried very hard, as Andrew also mentioned, to maintain their own cohesiveness, because there were a lot of pressure from their fighters on the ground to make sure to say that why are we not fighting instead of talking to the Americans. There are other reports that ISIS is using the same rhetoric to attract fighters, for example, to say that the Taliban are corrupted, that they're more compromising to the West. So it's not worth fighting for. It's not the true representative of Islamic thinking. So I would say the ideal situation for the Taliban would be to be able to work with the world and access financial and diplomatic resources on a de facto manner without necessarily a full-fledged recognition by the West that could potentially tend or undermine their rigid Islamic ideology that has been attracting their own constituency.
Thank you, Syed. I mean, it's right that they do not need the civilians or citizens' legitimacy. They receive their legitimacy from God. And similarly, without being diplomatically recognized, their leadership is able to freely travel internationally, not only to the regional capitals, but also to European capitals, as we recently saw when they traveled to both Geneva and Oslo. In this case, Lynn, how can the international community hold the Taliban accountable while engaging with them? In their opinion, it is better to engage with them rather than ostracize them because the cost would be greater. What do you think are some of the leverages and pressures, if any, that the US and others can exert on the Taliban to behave and not be a repressive regime that it currently is? Lynn, do you have us?
Yes, I do. My connection here is a little bit unstable, so my apologies in advance if I cut in and out. I don't think that we're dealing with, as Syed and Dr. Talib have said, a group of people who really care what, they're not responsive to threats or I do see them as wanting some level of legitimacy. I'm here in Islamabad, and people that I'm speaking to in government here say that they are not going to, even Pakistan is not going to recognize the Taliban as the legitimate authority in Afghanistan anytime soon. I can't see anybody wanting to do it until after the United States does it. And the United States is not going to rush to it. For one thing, I think what happened in Afghanistan in August is going to be an issue in the upcoming midterms. And so keeping it as quiet as possible is probably going to be the methodology, at least of one side, going into the elections. I really do not believe that it goes the way that you have mentioned, Farah, that there is going to be some leverage or pressure exerted from the international community that works on changing the Taliban, turning them into a group that actually governs, is able and willing to exercise what passes for governance in Afghanistan. I think that, as Dr. Talib said, what we're seeing is the Taliban using the misery of the a population of Afghanistan as leverage to get money and support, and if it comes to that, diplomatic recognition from the international community. But I just don't see that happening anytime soon. We seem to slip into revisionism very easily when it comes to talking about Taliban ruled Afghanistan. For the 20 years and under the Republic, Afghanistan was amongst the poorest and most corrupt countries in the world. Every year, organisations like the WFP warned that, last year the warning was, as we move into winter, 11 million Afghans are going to be food insecure. Lo and behold, the Taliban takes over, the financial resources of the country are frozen, and that number doubles. But the FAO has been there for 40 years and still the farmers can't sustain a drought. WFP has been there for 30 years and there's hunger every year. So, for me, I look at it in those terms and I see it's just worse than it was but it was still really bad. So what is it that needs to be done to make the situation better for ordinary Afghan people? I really believe that we take the Taliban out of the equation. The UN wants to put in $8 billion and restart the cycle of corruption that led to the fall, that in part led to the fall of the Republic in the first place. Do it. I would rather my taxes were used in a better and more effective way. But I think that supporting ordinary Afghan people to get through the worst of the situation that they face because of the Taliban takeover is much more important than diplomatic legitimacy for a bunch of former terrorists and drug dealers and murderers who are trying to please their own political constituency by not sending girls to school. Let's put it in the context that it deserves to be put in, and talk about the semantics once hunger has been alleviated and money starts flowing out of people's own bank accounts once more. That's my view.
Thank you, Lynn. So it's conclusive. We don't have any leverage over the Taliban to change their regressive policies. I wish we could take the Taliban out of the question realistically, because UN, as you mentioned, is asking for $8 billion in aid. And how do you really get it to the desperate people in need? The only way that I see that happening is through the creation of these parallel structures that actually weakened the authority of the former government of the Republic.
If I may say, Farah,
sure.
I don't believe that that's the only way. I have a friend who runs a grassroots Afghan NGO in Kabul, and he tells me that in the months since the Taliban takeover, hundreds of new NGOs have started up because there again they think we can get a slice of the pie. But in my view, I think that what we should be encouraging is dealing with smaller NGOs that can deliver direct, and there are some of them working very effectively, delivering 6 months supply of food, for instance, to communities of 1,000 families. That's, we're talking village, local level. It is happening, but UN agencies do not function like that. As you say, they set up parallel structures, they employ middlemen. The money was never followed, and I don't think that that's going to begin soon. These enormous organizations cannot change the way they function, but we can change the way we function and support smaller grassroots, direct delivery, no overhead organizations to do the work that needs to be done. There is another way. We just need the imagination.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lynn. I hope that somebody at UN is listening and can come up with creative ways to employ these grassroots NGOs in the country. I want to switch over to the region. Andrew, what is the region's attitude towards the Taliban takeover? How do you believe their policies have changed towards Afghanistan with the new leadership? Can you specifically talk about Pakistan, Russia, and China, and Iran in that case too?
Absolutely. We're going around the map. Maybe the first thing to note, and this could be the entire topic of our discussion today, how the region treats Afghanistan and how it now regards the Taliban. But a quick reminder and some historical context. Neighboring and regional countries saw the writing on the wall and began to prepare for the possibility of a Taliban takeover years before the Taliban reached the strength that it did last year. When the Obama administration began to announce a timeline for a withdrawal. This is almost a decade ago in 2011 and 12, and troops began to be reduced in 2013 and 14. Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan had always been close to and affiliated with the Taliban, but the rest of the region's powers realized then and there that no matter when it happened, the United States and its NATO and other partners were going to eventually leave. And they began to enter into a very pragmatic series of relationships with the Taliban. Up until about 2 years ago, that remained mostly hidden from public view. Once the United States appointed Zalmay Khalilzad to openly negotiate with the Taliban, regional powers looked at each other and said, oh, great. Well, if the United States is going to do it out in the open, then we can too. That really opened up some of what I think Lynn has already referred to, this act of bestowing legitimacy to the Taliban. It's still under sanctions, still labeled by many as a terrorist organization, and definitely a militant insurgency, as a group that was welcomed by regional powers. Now, that doesn't mean that regional states, Russia, China, Iran, don't have serious concerns about the Taliban and about what this group and its authority over Afghanistan means for stability. They are worried first and foremost about their borders and controlling borders between Afghanistan and all of its neighboring states has always been a serious issue. Some of the most serious issues in the country, in the region and the country's political relationships. So the region's neighbors worry about the flow of narcotics. They worry about the flow of mass migration, which has increased as people feel either terrified or just hopeless about the situation under the Taliban. New York Times reported recently that over 1 million people have crossed the border into Iran, hoping to make it to Europe or somewhere further since the August takeover. Russia has amassed troops in Central Asian states under the guise of collective security because it's incredibly worried about the flow of transnational and global terrorism out of Afghanistan into those neighboring states. China, which many in the Taliban, as soon as they took over Kabul and the country, began to speak effusively with lots of praise and expectation for a bold new relationship with China, have since grown much quieter as they realize that China is not going to be donating the amount and the type of aid that even their former enemies, the United States and other NATO powers, will do. China is not going to commit to serious investments or infrastructure projects until they see long-lasting stability. And that includes political stability, the kind that Dr. Taleb has noted may be impossible for the Taliban in its current form to achieve. So you have a lot of worried neighbors, realistic and pragmatic neighbors that will deal with the Taliban in the hopes of keeping Afghanistan's problems contained to its borders. But that's where their interests lie, keeping Afghanistan's problems contained.
It remains to be seen whether they are going to be successful in doing that, because oftentimes these problems have a way of spilling over. I just want to direct my next question to both Syed and Dr. Taleb. In your opinion, what is next for Afghanistan? Are the Taliban here to stay? Can we start with you, Dr. Taleb?
Okay, thank you. I think a lot of things were said need to be touched upon, but short of time, I can, in a legitimacy issue, I can mention one of the most destructive factor in this regard was United States policy toward Afghanistan, especially the Doha Agreement. In one hand, they gave kind of legitimacy to Taliban and ignored the legitimate government in Afghanistan. Regarding the leverage, I think we have a kind of leverage, but I don't know international community can manage that. I hope, in my view, it is in the best interest of Afghanistan region in the world. International community should refrain from recognizing Taliban. Second, they have to continue their humanitarian assistance through means that was mentioned in a kind of, you said, find out creative other ways in Afghanistan. The region, I think the most important thing I can mention, and I mentioned it before, Pakistan's strategy in Afghanistan. Pakistan is trying to frame Taliban into that strategy. I can say to box in Taliban in that strategy. And to this point, they were successful to some degree. The Pakistan strategy I can mention is, Pakistan is saying one thing, doing something. This is a conundrum. But this strategy can explain why this conundrum exists since many years in Afghanistan. One, Pakistan wants a junior partner in Afghanistan. To this point, they are successful. Pakistan wants to control the flow of energy from Central Asia to the South Asia. This is to be seen in the future. And the other thing is Taliban want to use the soil of Afghanistan for military purpose against India and possibly Iran and Russia as well. Regarding the Iran, I think right now, as Andrew mentioned, some countries are monitoring carefully. But at the end, I believe Iran's strategy will diverge from Taliban. This would be the most important thing to watch for the future in Afghanistan. As for the Taliban, I don't think Taliban will survive long. Internal resistance will continue. As you know right now, the brave women of Afghanistan is on the forefront of resistance right now. It will continue because Afghan people will never accept dictatorship for their future. So resistance will continue and it will expand and most probably it will morph into a military conflict and chaos in the future of Afghanistan. On the other hand, internal cohesion of Taliban, and right now everybody is saying they are a kind of less corrupt. This will change. When they get money, when they get possession, when they get incentives, this will impact negatively on the cohesion of Taliban. So my view is they will not survive for a long time.
Thank you. Syed, what is your input on what is next for Afghanistan under the Taliban regime?
Well, I'm not very optimistic, to be frank, about what the future holds for the country. I think the humanitarian crisis and the economic crisis will only exacerbate in the months to come and the next year, because none of the strategies and approaches that we're trying right now, the international community is trying, can and tries to address the root causes of the problems. I think that will be one of the most important and most obvious things that will come in the months. As the spring comes, security-wise, there might be some sorts and ships of even military resistance to the Taliban, and I think the Taliban are already worried about that, and that's why they're trying very hard to reach out to some of the old guards in the previous system to make sure that such a mobilization does not happen. We heard recently about a conversation and a meeting between ISI chief, Pakistani intelligence chief, and some old political leaders in Turkey, although we don't know about all of the details, but I assume that was aimed at containing some of the possibilities of military mobilization. The Taliban, my view about the longevity of the Taliban rule is a little more pessimistic than what Dr. Talib believes, to be honest. I think the Taliban will be around for some time. There will be resistance from the women, there will be resistance from the activists and the youth, but I think that none of them will be strong enough to pose a threat to the Taliban, especially given the huge disengagement in the international community in the West is undertaking, and the shifting priorities that's going to places like Ukraine, like China, like Taiwan, for example, that's happening in the bigger scheme of the things. On counterterrorism, I think I don't see any major threat stemming from Afghanistan in the near foreseeable future that would either threaten the US mainland or its key strategic partners and interests. But even if there are incidents, it'd be more targeted attacks and strikes from the United States, but I don't see the Taliban will try to escalate that to its interests. So they know the risks of that. What I would remain watchful on the counterterrorism side, I think, would be how the relationship between the Taliban and other regional and international terrorist organizations that it hosts in Afghanistan evolve. For example, what would happen if some of the Taliban partners or the groups that the Taliban host will start partnering up with ISIS, for example? What will happen if some of these groups start recruiting Afghans for their foreign ambitions in other countries, in other parts of the world? What will happen if they grow ambitions inside Afghanistan and threaten the Taliban itself or pose a security threat to the Taliban control? And I think that would change the dynamic, even how the United States would try to manage the counterterrorism component of this problem.
Thank you, Saeed. Those are some grim forecasts. I want to bring in Andrew here. Andrew, looking forward, with the Taliban now back in power, and as the West is trying to engage with them and work with them, although they are not giving an inch, does the West want the group to succeed if they are going along this trajectory? I mean, fatigue was a determining factor in the withdrawal of the West from Afghanistan. Now, what are your projections for the Western engagement, and where do they stand on, whether they want this group to succeed?
A really important question, and I'm afraid for our audience that, at least from my perspective here in Washington, it seems like policymakers really couldn't tell you, even 6 months after the takeover, whether they have a definitive answer to that question. It needs to be resolved in order for US policy towards Afghanistan to be coherent and to be effective. But what is clear is that half of the political establishment in Washington has mental barriers and blocks on the idea of ever having a functional relationship with the Taliban. And the other half, including the current administration, is torn between the negative optics and the negative impacts of having anything to do with the Taliban that might legitimize or strengthen them, but also concerns ranging from human rights, the humanitarian needs, but also the potential for regional instability. A stronger Taliban will lead to a number of negative effects. And I don't know anyone who studies or watches Afghanistan seriously who would deny that. But a weaker Taliban does not seem to have, as Syed has just pointed out, I think very well, and I agree with him, there's not many hopeful alternatives, certainly not in the near or medium term. And so a weaker Taliban may bring on exactly that thing that regional states and neighboring states and the US and the West want to avoid most, which is all of Afghanistan's problems and conflicts spilling out into the rest of the region. They don't have a good answer yet. And I think that's why we see so much confusion and so many causes of frustration still emanating from US policy. They seem to still be sorting it out.
Thank you, Andrew. So it seems like there is much to be seen. I want to end this session and open the next one to the audience questions. This is a question for everyone. How do you see the current food situation in Afghanistan? Winter is coming to an end, and can we consider that there actually is no famine? Lynn, can you respond to that, please?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Friends that I have who've come recently from Kabul to Pakistan, where I am, and friends inside still living in Afghanistan say that the problem is cash. There's food if they had the cash to buy it. You know that Afghanistan is very seriously reliant on imports of much of what it consumes, and food, of course, is a part of that. I think, you know, if people had money, then they would be able to buy food. Yeah, it's money that is the issue, cash, access to cash, their own cash.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What about you, Syed? What do you hear from friends and family back home about the famine and the grim humanitarian crisis?
So I would say there are multiple factors, I think. The lack of access to cash and this international sanctions and the Taliban that's now affecting the country, the entire country, is one of the problems. A lot of people who have cash in the banks cannot access their own money. Most of the private sector and in the region and even internationally are very worried about the consequence of doing transaction and business in Afghanistan, given the US sanctions, although some of it has been eased, but not a lot has happened on the ground yet. The other factor is that, as Lynn mentioned earlier, the economic situation and the food security is one of the things that has been worsening for much longer before the Taliban took over the country. The United Nations and others continued to warn about it, but neither the international community nor the Afghan government, unfortunately, did much to address that. And the Taliban's takeover has exacerbated it because of their lack of capacity to govern, because of their repressive policies and intimidation. So the sense of trust and stability that's needed for the economic market to function, for people to go about their businesses and about their normal lives, has totally disappeared. So I'm very worried about that, because even, for example, if people access their own money in the banks that Len mentioned, my expectation is that a lot of people, and from what I'm hearing from the ground, is that a lot of people will use that money to flee the Taliban rule rather than put that back into the market through buying, for example, critical commodities. The issue of asset reserves, for example, that has been in the news for much of the time, and a lot of people who say that the central bank needs to access this in order for the liquidity crisis to be managed, assumes that the Taliban will definitely manage the central bank as a very professional monetary institution, something that I don't see them either willing or even capable of doing. So I'll stop at that.
Thank you so much. Yes, you're right. How independent will the central bank be? And even when receiving the frozen funds, how will they manage all of these reserves? I mean, we struggled with the lack of capacity in the best of times under the former government. And because of brain drain, as Lynn earlier mentioned, that issue has exacerbated under this regime, something that they don't seem too particularly keen to address just now. However, I just want to add to that audience question in that the situation is actually pretty bad. It's much worse than in previous years. I know there are so many bad news coming out of Afghanistan year after year that we all sound like the boy who cried wolf. But this year is particularly bad. It has significantly reduced people's abilities to access basic necessities. And only those people are doing relatively better who actually have families that live abroad and can send remittances. So moving on to the next audience questions. What do you think about the possible rivalry between the Taliban and key regional jihadist groups? We all know that there is currently about 20 jihadi groups operating out of Afghanistan. Some are friends with the Taliban, some like ISIK, who isn't. And Andrew, what do you think about this rivalry as well as this cooperation between the Taliban and these various groups?
Yeah, I mean, Afghanistan has been the home to a really complicated jihadist landscape dating back decades before the United States even intervened. Different movements of religious extremists and violent armed actors have been stewing in a cauldron in Afghanistan for 40 years now. And the Islamic State is in some ways unique, but in other ways is just a reflection of that still very messy landscape. It's also a lesson in some of what Dr. Talib has touched on, the identity of the Taliban, its roots, its ethnic constituencies, as the Islamic State in Afghanistan seemed to originate from cross-border movement of Pakistani militants into the eastern regions of Afghanistan. And that's why we saw it take hold in eastern Afghanistan and, the ability to seize territory. Unfortunately, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, it seems that the Islamic State has transformed itself and proven adaptive. It's no longer just a group of Pakistani militants that live in the border regions of the country. It's now an ideological movement of its own that has spread across Afghan universities, that has moved into different ethnic groups in different parts of the country. What worries me most about the future is, while there will be fierce competition and likely suppression from the Taliban of any group that tries to rival the Taliban's ideological authority in the extremist and jihadist space, what worries me most is that as the Taliban continue to fail to deliver certain services or protections to the Afghan people, there's going to be an incredible void of alternatives where people can turn, because the Taliban don't allow for a pluralistic society where you can choose a political party or you can choose to voice your dissent. And that's going to leave people to turn to something that's in the shadows and to turn to something darker that they can lash out and give power to their anger. And in many parts of the country, that could be the Islamic State. So I really worry about its growth potential and its recruitment potential in the years to come.
On that note, do you agree with Syed when he said that the Islamists that are going to find a safe haven in Afghanistan, according to the UN report, will not be much of a problem for the US security and national interests?
Yeah, I think someone said after August that Afghanistan isn't just the graveyard of empires, it's the graveyard of predictions. And that was certainly proven true last year. And I don't want to say what will or won't be a threat to the United States, because I don't think anyone ever predicted in early 2001 that the threat to the United States was emanating from a group based in Afghanistan. But what I will say is it's certainly the region's problem first. And no one has more reason to be concerned than regional powers. Ironically and tragically, Pakistan, maybe most of all. We've seen such a wealth of evidence that extremism across a variety of groups, domestic groups in Pakistan, are taking more action against the Pakistani state, against their security services. There are more bombs going off, there are more shootings. China has already expressed grave concern as some of the sites and the locations that have been targeted really could impact some of China's investment in Pakistan and across South Asia. Russia, likewise, I referred briefly to some of the moves that it's made for collective security for Central Asia, and Iran has to be concerned. For every million Afghans traveling across its border, as we've noted, just since August, they must certainly be worried. I think the evolution of the jihadist landscape has also trended towards regional focus. That's not to say that many of these groups don't have global ambitions, but you look at the last decade of terrorist activity in South Asia, we're talking about South Asian cities being hit. We're talking about shootings taking place in Central Asian checkpoints on border crossings and highways. This is the real concern. It's going to impact the region first.
Thank you. And
if I can have a quick point, Fara, here.
Sure, go ahead.
Just a quick clarification after everything that Andrew said. What I earlier said about the U.S. threat, I meant that I don't think there will be a threat that would necessarily have the Taliban as a key perpetrator or the key collaborator that would have the United States take very drastic military actions against the Taliban as the de facto sort of controller of a state apparatus in Afghanistan, rather than other groups who might operate out of the country.
Thank you for that clarification. And I was going to say that, Andrea, I agree with you that the region has been the focus of these jihadi groups. Case in point, just in the recent Kazakhstan protests, their president came out that there have been elements of Afghans and Afghan groups in that sort of public uprising. Lynn, here is a question for you. You recently spoke to Amrullah Saleh, the former vice president, who together with Ahmad Massoud has been meeting the Taliban leadership, and it has been mediated by the regional countries. What exactly are they discussing? What can we expect from those meetings?
The younger Ahmad Massoud has been making some quite a bit of effort at outreach. He's been to Paris, as we know, the French like him very much. He's been to Tehran, he's been to Moscow, he's due to come here in the near future. So far as he seems to be sticking to the demands that formed the policy basis of the National Resistance Front from the beginning, from September, that they want an inclusive government. But basically what they want is a federalised Afghanistan. And so far, he's stuck pretty much to his policy positions. I don't think that there's going to be any movement between him and the Taliban, no matter where those meetings are and who they are mediated by, until there's a little bit of give and take on each side. He's probably thinking that the Taliban aren't going to give anything and they're not going to last. So why should we change our own policy stance? I think, to get back to what Andrew was saying earlier about the situation in the region, I think he's very right that Pakistan is facing not quite an existential threat, but it is certainly facing threats from groups that are now basing themselves over the border in Afghanistan. The TTP does that. And we also have the rise of Baluch nationalistic attacks as well. Between the 2nd and the 5th of February, there were coordinated complex attacks on two military headquarters 500 kilometres apart that lasted for days and ended up with many dead Pakistan Army soldiers. And one Western diplomat I spoke to said, if this was happening in my country, we would call this a civil war. And there are people, you get the range of descriptives when you talk to people about the threat of homegrown terrorism here in Pakistan, from it's a bit of argy-bargy in the border regions to there is a very real threat of civil war. Of course, the military here is strengthening its own position and its own, it controls the civilian government, it controls the media, it controls civil society, and it is strengthening its control over the economy as well. And I think that this situation will also increase, we will see a broadening and a deepening of this situation in Pakistan as well. My feeling about the NRF and the anti-Taliban forces mostly outside of the country is that they're not united. They don't really have yet a united position, and they're not yet willing, at least publicly, to compromise on the position that they have. But if there is amongst the Western international community a move to try and balance the Taliban, I don't think anyone's going to get rid of, no one's going to be talking about getting rid of the Taliban in the near future. Whether they can last under their own steam or not is another question. But I think that what the international community would like to do is, rather than talk about going to war and spring offensives, as we've heard recently, and armed resistance, I think they would like a political landscape that includes an opposition, whether or not it's formed around Ahmad Massoud and Amrullah Saleh and their group of people now based in Dushanbe or not. I also see some rumours about Ashraf Ghani being brought back. I don't believe that. I see the former warlords and politicians also manoeuvring and meeting and sweeping on the embassies and paying up their rents and, trying to solidify some sort of an international position that way. I don't think that that's going to work. I think they're discredited and discreditable. And I think maybe with the NRF, watch this space, but I think it's a long shot.
Your conclusion is that much remains to be seen. There are so many elements and factors in development that much remains to be seen on what happens in both Afghanistan and the region. However, the unanimous conclusion is a pessimistic overview of the future to come. I thank you all for participating in this very insightful and fruitful discussion. Thank you to all of our panelists. And with that, I would like to conclude this discussion. I hope our audience enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to everyone for viewing our event today and for joining us for Afghanistan After the Collapse, where we are now and what comes next. If you're interested in staying up to date with future events from the NTF, including a follow-up event that will occur in a few months on Afghanistan, please see the links that are now pasted in the chat for more information and for signups. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day or have a great evening.